slavery. Over the past 20 or 30 years, both countries have seen a rise in this discourse, a more kind of bringing it to the forefront in specific heritage sites. So I was really curious as to why. Why now, why this time period, and what was the catalyst for these changes? The research really focused on the transitions from a private dwelling, an active plantation, or a place of business to a heritage sector, to demonstrating history and articulating history for the masses, and the subsequent evolution of slavery in those sites. I spanned 3 plantations in the U.S. I went to Virginia, Montpelier, I went to Drayton Hall in South Carolina, and I went to Whitney Plantation in Louisiana. I similarly went around the UK. I went to Harewood House in Leeds, Paxton House in Scotland, Berwick-upon-Tweed, and Georgian House in Bristol. Throughout most of my research, I was told over and over again that they're very different. The US and the UK are very, very different. They can't be compared, can't be done. I was told for a long time that there were immense differences between the US and the UK. And when I went through my research, I found that that was really true. There were also some very interesting similarities between the two. And those similarities were very apparent when I looked at representation of slavery. They had very similar challenges when articulating this history, including, and what I found very poignant, was the distinct transition from when a site goes to a plantation, to a familial home, from a place of business, to a heritage site. A narrative is created, a position in history, a reason this site is important, and people need to see it. And that narrative, that first narrative, often extremely whitewashed, not at all discussing the complexities of slavery, sticks with the site. No matter how much evolution goes on, no matter who comes in and takes over the site and changes that narrative, that one original narrative, that one original story always is present. It's the main one, and everything around it changes. And not only does that make infusing a more complex story difficult, it's adverse to it. It blocks it. It makes it a massive hurdle that I think some people can't see when they're in the thick of it in these sites. However, one of the other aspects of my research was looking at the successes. We have seen slavery represented in many different ways in many different sites. Some more complex, some more surface, but what were these successes? How did that happen? What were the forces behind that representation? Overwhelmingly, when I looked at external forces for more complex discourse around slavery representation, it was descendants. Descendants coming into sites, telling those that were governing, that were curating these spaces, that they weren't doing it properly, and infusing it with their stories, their history, their legacy. So I'm going to present you with an example. Montpelier in Orange County, Virginia. For those that don't know, Montpelier is the home of President James Madison. He is the 4th President of the United States. He's also Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State. So James Madison, he had a familial home. This top one at the very top, that was his father, James Madison Sr.'s home. This is James Madison, and at the end, when he died, this was his and Dolly's house. When he and Dolly died, they didn't have any descendants. They sold their house. It went to the DuPont family, very wealthy family in Virginia. They built over it. They added and built over it. So this was the DuPont family's house when they sold it to the National Trust for Historic Preservation in the 1970s. The 1980s. It was acquired in 1984, and it was opened to the public in 1987. So as you can guess, when this site was open to the public, what was its main narrative? A president lived here. A very important president. The father of the Constitution lived here. And that, though it was a DuPont house, that was the main narrative that was presented at the site. So they kept the old DuPont house. They considered kind of taking it back to the Madison era, but they kept the DuPont house. Over time, those that had descended from the enslaved at the plantation came back. They started having reunions and parties at the site. And so one year, Rebecca Coleman came, and this was after a bit of time. The DuPont house had finally gotten a bursary of money, and so they were able to finally take down the and take it back to James Madison's era. So they spent $10 million to take this house back to James Madison. And so they brought in a family reunion, a party of the descendants of the enslaved, and showed them the new house. Part of this new renovation was going to the South Yard and showing them where the enslaved cabins would have been, the slave quarters. And how they marked it was grass and tiles. And that was their contribution to that narrative, that complex history. And so Rebecca Coleman, one of the descendants of the enslaved, walked around the entire Madison house, and this was her response. Where are my people? Spent $24 million on the Madisons, and all my people get are dead grass and railroad ties. That one conversation, that one comment spurred. All of a sudden, consultations are starting to happen. Descendants are brought back onto the site to consult on representation. And a few years later, they opened a a permanent exhibition in the basement called Mere Distinction of Color. And they've now started to completely redo the South Yard and rebuild up the slave quarters. So these one conversation, there it is. This one conversation, this critique, and what came from it, this community involvement, this growth, this voice of the enslaved, changed the Madison house immensely. It's not perfect. It can still has Madison's narrative. That single original narrative is still there, but they're actively working to do something about it. They've had some issues recently, but that is still a forefront on there. We've recently had descendants have now been welcomed to the board of directors after some immense drama. I would recommend looking into that. It's an interesting story. But it's something, it's a moving forward, and it contributed complex change to the site. So the infusion, the listening of the community and the descendants, and applying that into the site's narrative can have a distinct and lasting influence on complex narratives within these sites. So that's my American example. I'm going to hand it over to Lois now to give more domestic and local examples.
Okay. So when I do these talks, I always put up a quick sensitivity warning just because of some of the objects that I am and because of the nature of what we're talking about. So, as I said before in the tours, I work in the Slavery Museum in education. And of course, there's a lot of challenges with having this museum here and trying to talk about these stories because, as Mary said, there are these dominant narratives, and how do we challenge them? So I want to talk a bit about some of the challenges that museums and a lot of other heritage sites face. So you all might be aware that Tristan Hunt, who's head of V&A Museum Group, he put out this in, I think it was The Guardian, and he said to decolonize somewhere like the V&A is to decontextualize it. So he said that we can't decolonize, we can't tell full stories, full histories, because that will decontextualize what we have here. So it's that holding on to power that a lot of these places have. And we know that museums, heritage sites, there's a lot of silences here, and there's different types of silences that go on with dominant ideas in society, silences because the site, the organisation isn't ready to tackle certain histories. And you can see that places like the V&A with Tristan Hunt trying to hold on to that power. And then again in 2021, I believe, Oliver Dowden sent this letter to a lot of museums, a lot of heritage sites, saying that the government doesn't support the removal of statues, of objects, and you should be talking about or taking actions motivated by activism or politics. But we've got this museum here, it's the National Slavery Museum, where we're talking about slavery, legacies, politics, so how do we do that? And we did put up in 2020 these plaques that you've seen all across our museums to try and talk about this history, but we still get a lot of people coming in and saying, why do you have these plaques here? You're talking about politics. But our museums are all government funded by the political body that runs the country, so we are political, and there's no way to get away from that. Yeah, so I have this example up here that I always use in education groups or when I'm on gallery, and it's the consequences of being silent, of not telling the full pictures of history. So in our museum, we only really have one object that talks about Windrush. And a lot of people, as I said on our tours, we don't really talk about British civil rights movement, we don't address these things, we're very, very silent on these issues. And one of the consequences of that, where in 2017 when this massive scandal came out, and a lot of people in this country didn't understand that through transatlantic slavery and through the Windrush generation, these people have contributed so much to making this country what it is, but all these secret charter flights getting these people out of the country, a lot of people turned a blind eye to it, didn't want to hear about it, didn't think that these people were important and valuable because for so long their histories have not been told. And Malik said it a lot better than I did when he's talking about for so long our stories have been told by white people. It wasn't us telling our stories. A lot of the reason why there are so few black people on history courses that are interested in history is because for so long, from they were very, very young, you know, the person that was telling them about who they are, what their history is, has always been a white person telling you who you are, this is your story, and limiting it to transatlantic slavery. And that again reinforces in, you know, the black person that they don't have a story, but also reinforces in white people that these people don't have a story. If they are getting shipped away or having their lives, you know, disenfranchised by the NHS or other things, why should we care? But I do have some objects here from our handling collection at the International Slavery Museum, and I have some mock landing cards that the Goldsmiths University made. So if you guys want to come up and look at those. Yeah. So I love this quote by Andy Andrews, and he says it a lot in a lot of his talks when you listen to them. And this world is shaped in the image of white supremacy. Because of this trade, because of the transatlantic slave trade, you know, it changed politics, it changed how we see people, it created this idea of race that has no biological foundation. Everything that we do is shaped in the image of white supremacy. The people, you know, globally that are the most disenfranchised people are usually black and brown people because of the legacies of this. And as a museum, as a university, we have to be aware that this is how the world is when we are working with our communities. So I wanted to talk a bit about co-production. So obviously that's something that is a word that we throw around a lot, especially in this institution, and not a lot of people have an idea of exactly what that is. There's no, often there is no real set definition, and co-production or working with communities, it changes depending on what community you're working on, who you're working on, why, what are the outcomes. But it's important for us to remember the asymmetries of co-production. You know, I think I was said in one of the tours today, co-production literally does marginalize people. We have a white institution, you know, funded by a white supremacist culture that we have, with white people working there, stretching out their arms to work with these communities, but often not acknowledging the asymmetries in this relationship. And it's very much that, you know, benevolent whiteness of, you know, empire or commonwealth of, I'm helping you, I'm the one helping you, but still holding on to and retaining that power. Next slide. Yeah, so this is a quote from Stuart Hall, where he said that we need to question the constructed and contextual nature of the authority which some people acquire to write the culture of others. And in this article, he actually spoke about the old International Slavery Museum when it was in the basement of the Maritime, and he said that one of the things that it doesn't address is whiteness. And again, on the tours, I was very, very transparent. I said that we still don't really address that in our museums, in our galleries across National Museums of Liverpool. We are very silent on this issue of whiteness and white supremacy. Why is that? What are we holding on to? And I have this object here to talk about co-production and working with communities and the importance of us telling our own stories. So this is a replica object, and we have the real one in Slavery Museum. It's a neck iron, it's a punishment collar from a plantation in Jamaica. And it would have been worn around an enslaved person's neck for up to 2 weeks. So you can imagine somebody's living, working, eating, sleeping in this. It's heavy, it's cast iron. If you're on the field, it could burn you. It's a horrific object. But what we learned about it, so this bar here goes at the back of somebody's neck. A lot of community members from West African cultures, particularly Yoruba cultures, they would come into our museum and they would see this hand symbol and they would look at it and be like, wait, is that an insult? Because in a lot of, on a lot of plantations, often the blacksmith could have been an enslaved African, and that's what we believe about this object. And some of our community members came in and said that this hand symbol, and often in West African culture, putting up your hand like that, is a sign of disrespect. So we think that this bar that would go at the back of your neck, pointing towards the owners, towards the overseers, as a way to insult them using your culture. We think that this is a way for somebody to fight back, to use their cultural tool as resistance. And the only way we would have understood and unpacked this story is because of working with people, working with the communities, and that's why it's so important to have these voices represented. But we can't just do that as we're inviting this freelancer, we're inviting this person in to work with us, but they're not in the institution. And as Malik said, we need people at every single level inside the institutions, as well as working with the communities, because we see things differently, as black people and as a woman, a black woman from the diaspora, our lens is very, very different. And as Malik was talking about with his autoethnographic research, he saw things differently in those archives than a lot of other people who probably weren't looking for what he was looking for, or don't understand the sensitivities of where he's coming from, wouldn't have been able to unpack. And that's why we can't just have co-production as we're going to work with these people, or we pay them so it's okay. We need people in the organizations telling their own stories, speaking for themselves, because our voice is very powerful and it has been silent for so long. Yeah. So I love this quote, I use it all the time. So in response to Tristan Hunt saying that to decolonize the V&A is to decontextualize, Sanaya Kassim wrote this amazing article, and she couldn't get it published because none of the UK newspapers wanted to publish it. So she, I think it's on Medium, like she did it as a blog post. And she said that the texture of colonial violence is often smooth, bureaucratic, and impartial. And she's talking about that softness. Well, we can't work with communities because we don't have the funding, or we can't do this, that softness of that violence that keeps this system of white supremacy going and going. And that's what she's unpacking here. And her article was called Museums Are the Master's House. Museums are these spaces of power, traditionally of power, where people have been marginalised, have been excluded. And if museums are the master's house, then where does that position me as a black woman? I'm just outside working, for the people inside the museum to take my knowledge, take my resources, to put it more on display again and again. So I think it's a very, very powerful quote. But I want to end because the title of our talk is like, what can we do? And in Andre Law's famous Master's Tools Can Never Dismantle the Master's House, she says that one of the tools that we can use to fight against this racist, patriarchal, white supremacist system is community and coming together and accepting each other and working with each other through radical acceptance and radical community building. And at the end of whenever I talk, I always use this image because I love it so much. So I want to ask all of you, as like a reflection point, what can we do? What tools can we create to dismantle the master's house, dismantle these Babylon systems? So here we've got a picture of the Rosehampton estate in Jamaica, and this is after the revolution that they had, and a lot of great houses were burnt down, and a lot of different revolutions in Jamaica and in other parts of the Caribbean. A lot of these great houses were burnt down. There's very, very few of them in places like Jamaica today. And you can see there's community, people getting together to destroy this house, these systems. And so community is a big element in this, and I just want everybody to have this reflection. What can we do? What other tools are there that we can use to go forward and dismantle these systems? Because it's not good enough for us to have these, smooth, bureaucratic and partial, well, we're going to do it, well, we can work with communities maybe, or we tried, we're doing a little bit better, but it's not good enough. We need to dismantle these systems because they hold up injustice for everybody. Injustice, somewhere is injustice everywhere.